In 1945, as Europe celebrated the end of World War II, champagne flowing in the streets of Paris and London, fireworks exploding over Moscow's Red Square, another operation was already underway. This one was quieter, more sinister, conducted in shadows and whispers across a continent still smoldering from 6 years of total war. Thousands of men from the fallen Third Reich vanished without a trace. These weren't ordinary soldiers returning home to rebuild their shattered lives, to till the soil or work in factories. These were men with blood on their hands, architects of genocide, orchestrators of mass murder, enforcers of the final solution. Men whose names appeared on wanted lists in every Allied nation. Men who had spent years implementing the most systematic program of human extermination the world had ever seen. Men who had one single mission now: escape. And many of them succeeded. Their destination wasn't the obvious choices, not Spain, despite Franco's sympathies and the debt he owed to Hitler's support during the Spanish Civil War. Not Switzerland, despite its famous neutrality and banking secrecy, where so much stolen Nazi gold had already found its way. Not even the deserts of Arabia, where some Nazi sympathizers and collaborators had found refuge among anti-British Arab nationalists. No, their destination was far more unexpected. A land so distant from the rubble of Europe that it might as well have been another world entirely. A place where Spanish was spoken, where European culture mixed with Latin American passion, where a man could disappear into bustling cities or remote countryside with equal ease. Argentina, a country of endless pampas and soaring Andes, of European immigrants and cosmopolitan cities, of tango and beef and wine. A country that in 1945 was quietly, systematically opening its doors to the architects of history's greatest crime. Not by accident, not through oversight, but through calculated policy, implemented at the highest levels of government. This is the dark side of a story the world tried to forget. The Nazis who never truly disappeared. They didn't die in the bunkers of Berlin or hang at Nuremberg. They didn't face justice for their crimes or pay for the millions of lives they destroyed. They simply changed their names, learned a new language, forged new documents, and started over. They became the ghosts of the Third Reich, living in plain sight, walking the streets of Buenos Aires, raising families, running businesses, drinking coffee in sidewalk cafes, dying peacefully in their beds decades later, surrounded by children and grandchildren who often never knew the truth. This is their story. The story of the men who escaped justice, the networks that helped them, and the country that sheltered them. The story of how the most wanted war criminals in history found sanctuary in South America. The story of a dark chapter that many would prefer to forget. But that must be remembered, because those who forget history, as the saying goes, are condemned to repeat it. When the Reich fell in May 1945, Berlin was nothing but rubble and smoke. The city that had once hosted the Olympics in 1936, showcasing Nazi propaganda and Aryan supremacy to the world, that had been the gleaming capital of Hitler's promised 1,000-year Reich, was reduced to a moonscape of destruction. Block after block of shattered buildings, streets filled with debris and the bodies of the dead. Soviet soldiers raising their red flag over the burnt-out shell of the Reichstag. The Führer was dead by his own hand in his underground bunker, his body burned beyond recognition. Eva Braun dead beside him. Goebbels and his family dead. The dream of Germanic supremacy had ended in apocalyptic ruin. But for some men the war wasn't over. It was simply entering a new, more dangerous phase. The phase of survival. They knew exactly what awaited them if they were captured by the Allies. They had seen the newsreels from Nuremberg, where their former colleagues and superiors sat in the dock, listening to hours of testimony about concentration camps and gas chambers, about medical experiments and death marches, about millions murdered in the name of racial purity and Lebensraum. They knew the penalty for what they had done: death by hanging for the major criminals, or if they were extremely lucky, life imprisonment in Allied jails. Either way, their lives as they knew them were over. So they ran, and they ran with remarkable organization and support, using secret escape routes that became known as the rat lines, named after the lines that ran up a ship's rigging. They fled Europe with help from an unlikely and controversial alliance. Catholic priests, some motivated by anti-communist ideology, others by misguided mercy, provided false identity papers and sanctuary. They claimed the men were refugees fleeing communist persecution in Eastern Europe, displaced persons seeking new lives in the chaos of post-war Europe. Fascist sympathizers in Spain, Italy, and Argentina provided money and contacts, and covert networks, some with possible connections to Western intelligence agencies already thinking about the coming Cold War, helped facilitate their escape. The Vatican's role remains one of the most controversial aspects of this story. While there's no evidence that Pope Pius XII directly ordered assistance to Nazi war criminals, there's substantial documentation that certain priests and bishops, working through organizations like Caritas and using Vatican passports and connections, helped numerous Nazis escape. Whether this was rogue action by individual clergy or something more systematic remains debated by historians to this day. Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, was particularly active. He openly believed that helping these men was a form of Christian charity and a bulwark against Soviet communism. He worked tirelessly to provide them with false papers, shelter, and passage to South America. From the ports of Genoa, Rome, and Trieste, they boarded ships bound for the far south. Some traveled via Spain, staying in Franco's fascist state while arrangements were made. Others went through Switzerland or France. But they all had the same destination: South America, and primarily Argentina. Some went to Brazil, Paraguay, or Chile, but Argentina was the preferred destination. It was prosperous, European in culture, far from the theaters of war, and most importantly, its government was actively welcoming. They carried new names on elaborately forged documents. Hans became Juan, Friedrich became Federico, Klaus became Carlos. They memorized new identities, practiced new signatures, rehearsed new personal histories. They became refugees from the Sudetenland, ethnic Germans displaced from Poland, Austrian civilians fleeing Soviet occupation. Whatever story would work, whatever lie would get them through customs and immigration. And they carried something else too: suitcases filled with stolen gold, looted art, cash and jewelry taken from the victims of the Holocaust. The wealth of murdered Jews, melted down, converted, transformed into financing for new lives in a new world. Some of this treasure had been stored in Swiss banks during the war. Some had been hidden in salt mines and mountain caves. Now it was being transferred to South America, ensuring that these fugitives wouldn't just survive, but could thrive. The journey across the Atlantic took weeks. Cramped quarters below deck for some, first-class cabins for others who had enough money and good enough papers. They traveled constantly vigilant, always watching for anyone who might recognize them from their past lives, always fearful that an Allied intelligence agent might be on board, tracking them. They grew beards or shaved them off. They changed their appearance, their mannerisms, their way of speaking.
But as the ships drew closer to Buenos Aires, as the coast of Argentina came into view, the Rio de la Plata opening before them, they began to breathe easier. They were approaching sanctuary. Argentina, under President Juan Domingo Perón, was actively recruiting European immigrants. Perón, a former military officer with fascist sympathies who had openly admired Mussolini's Italy, saw these German refugees as valuable assets. He spoke of bringing European civilization and technical expertise to Argentina. He wanted scientists, engineers, military experts, men who could help him modernize Argentina's military and industrial capacity, men who could help him pursue his dreams of making Argentina a major world power. That many of these men were war criminals didn't seem to trouble him. Or perhaps, in his worldview shaped by military authoritarianism and anti-communist paranoia, it didn't matter. The enemy now was Soviet communism, not defeated German fascism. And these men, with their knowledge and their fervent anti-communism, could be useful. Immigration records from the period tell a striking story. Between 1946 and 1950, thousands of German and Austrian nationals entered Argentina on what were clearly false papers. The Red Cross, operating through its international committee, issued travel documents that were supposed to be for refugees and displaced persons. But as later investigations would show, many were issued to men whose real identities were concealed, whose pasts were deliberately obscured. Argentine consulates in Europe, acting on orders from Buenos Aires, issued entry visas with minimal scrutiny. The paperwork would be in order: names, photographs, stamps, signatures. But the names were false. The photographs were recent, not matching wartime records. The applicants' histories were fabrications. They settled across Argentina, but particularly in certain areas. Buenos Aires absorbed thousands, disappearing into the city's large German-speaking community. The capital had neighborhoods where German was spoken as commonly as Spanish, where German shops and restaurants and social clubs provided familiar comfort. A Nazi war criminal could walk the streets of Buenos Aires, enter a cafe, order in German, read a German-language newspaper, and feel almost at home. Córdoba, Argentina's second city, attracted others, and Mendoza, at the foot of the Andes near the Chilean border, became home to scientists and engineers. But it was further south, deep in Patagonia, where the most notorious found their most secure refuge. In remote towns surrounded by mountains and lakes, in valleys accessible only by rough roads, they found what they craved most: silence and oblivion. Distance from the watchful eyes of Allied intelligence, distance from Nazi hunters and journalists, distance from their past. They changed their names but often kept their skills. The doctor who had performed experiments in Dachau became a family physician in a small Argentine town. The engineer who had designed V-2 rocket components went to work for Argentine aerospace companies. The SS officer who had commanded death squads became a businessman, a factory manager, a landowner. And they waited. They waited for the world to forget. They waited for the immediate post-war fury to fade. They waited for new conflicts to replace old ones, for the Cold War to make their crimes seem less important than their potential usefulness. For many of them, the waiting worked. They lived out their lives in peace, never facing trial, never publicly confessing, never paying for their crimes except perhaps in nightmares. They died in their beds, decades after their victims had died in gas chambers and mass graves, and were buried under false names in Argentine cemeteries. The Great Escape had succeeded.
One of them was Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust itself, the man who organized the trains to the death camps with bureaucratic efficiency, the man who sat in his office in Berlin, managing the logistics of genocide like a shipping clerk handling freight manifests, the man responsible for coordinating the deportation and murder of millions of Jews across Europe. Karl Adolf Eichmann was born in Zollingen, Germany in 1906, but grew up in Austria. He joined the Nazi Party in 1932 and the SS shortly after. By 1934, he was working in the SD, the Nazi intelligence service, specifically in the department dealing with Jewish affairs. He became an expert on Zionism and Jewish emigration, studying Hebrew, reading Zionist literature, even visiting Palestine in 1937. But his expertise wasn't motivated by sympathy. It was motivated by his role in making the Reich free of Jews, first through forced emigration,
then through deportation, and finally, through extermination. When the final solution was implemented in 1942, Eichmann was placed in charge of all transportation arrangements. It was his department that scheduled the trains, coordinated with local authorities, ensured the smooth flow of victims from occupied territories to the death camps. He was present at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where the systematic extermination of European Jewry was formally planned. He visited Auschwitz and other camps, inspecting the machinery of death he had helped set in motion. By any measure, he was one of the most guilty men in the Nazi hierarchy. Yet he escaped the immediate post-war roundup. In May 1945, as Germany collapsed, Eichmann was captured by American forces, but they didn't realize who they had. He was using a false identity, and his name wasn't yet on the most wanted lists. He escaped from Allied custody and went into hiding in Germany, working as a lumberjack under an assumed name, keeping his head down, waiting for his chance. That chance came in 1950. With help from the network that was smuggling former Nazis to South America, using papers identifying him as Ricardo Clement, he made his way to Argentina. His wife and children followed later, though they entered under different names to avoid drawing attention. In Argentina, Eichmann lived under the name Ricardo Clement. He worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory in Buenos Aires, operated a small farm, did odd jobs. He lived in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood. He had a wife, Vera, who had followed him to Argentina. They had children. They had neighbors with whom they exchanged pleasantries. They attended local events. He was just another German immigrant, of which there were thousands in Argentina. No one suspected who he really was. Or if anyone did suspect, they kept silent. The German community in Argentina had an unspoken code. Don't ask about the past. Don't dig into where people came from or what they did during the war. Just live in the present. Look forward, not back. For a decade, this worked perfectly for Eichmann. He was cautious, didn't draw attention to himself, didn't boast about his past. Unlike some Nazi fugitives who couldn't resist nostalgia, who met in secret to reminisce about the Reich's glory days, Eichmann kept his head down. But the past has a way of catching up. Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, had been searching for Eichmann since the State of Israel was founded in 1948. He was at the top of their list, the man more responsible than perhaps any other for the destruction of European Jewry, living free somewhere while survivors tried to rebuild their shattered lives. It was intolerable. The breakthrough came in 1957, when German prosecutors investigating Nazi crimes received information from a half-Jewish German named Lothar Hermann, living in Argentina. Hermann's daughter was dating a man named Klaus Eichmann, Adolf's son, who had made some troubling comments about Jews and had let slip details about his father's past. Hermann contacted German authorities, who passed the information to Israeli intelligence.
The Mossad spent months verifying the lead. They sent an agent to Buenos Aires who confirmed that a man named Ricardo Clement, living at a specific address, matched photographs of Adolf Eichmann. They watched him, photographed him, documented his movements. They were certain this was him. In 1960, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion authorized a covert operation to capture Eichmann and bring him to Israel to stand trial. It would be a violation of Argentine sovereignty, a breach of international law, but Ben-Gurion believed it was justified. This was the architect of the Holocaust. He needed to face justice. The world needed to hear what had been done, directly from one of the men most responsible. A team of Mossad agents arrived in Buenos Aires posing as businessmen. For weeks they watched Eichmann, learning his routines, planning the capture. He took the same bus home from work every evening, walking the same route from the bus stop to his house. They identified the perfect location, a quiet spot along his route where a car could pull up without being seen. On May 11, 1960, as the sun was setting, Adolf Eichmann stepped off his usual bus and began walking home. A car pulled up beside him. Mossad agents jumped out, grabbed him, and forced him into the vehicle. The entire operation took seconds. He tried to resist, but it was futile. Within minutes, he was at a safe house being guarded by Israeli agents. For over a week, Eichmann was held in the safe house while the Mossad team arranged his extraction from Argentina. They sedated him, dressed him in an airline uniform, and smuggled him onto an El Al flight that had brought an Israeli delegation to Buenos Aires for Argentina's independence celebrations. On May 21, 1960, the plane took off with Eichmann aboard, unconscious, heading to Israel. Days later, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion announced to the Israeli parliament, "I have to inform the Knesset that a short time ago, Israeli security services found one of the greatest of the Nazi war criminals, Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible, together with the Nazi leaders, for what they called the final solution to the Jewish problem, that is, the extermination of 6 million Jews of Europe. Adolf Eichmann is already under arrest in Israel and will soon be put on trial." The announcement shocked the world. Argentina protested the violation of its sovereignty. The UN Security Council passed a resolution expressing concern. But the Israeli government was unmoved. This was the architect of the Holocaust. He would face trial. Eichmann's capture revealed a disturbing truth to the international community. Argentina had become a safe haven for Nazi war criminals, not by accident or oversight, but through deliberate policy. The Perón government, and its successors, had knowingly allowed these men to enter and settle. Some estimates suggested that over 5,000 former Nazis had found refuge in Argentina. But Eichmann was only the tip of the iceberg. There was Joseph Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, who had conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners, including twins, whom he had a particular fascination with. Mengele had also escaped to Argentina, arriving in 1949. He lived openly for years, even obtaining Argentine citizenship under his real name in 1956. After Eichmann's capture, sensing that he might be next, Mengele fled to Paraguay and then Brazil, where he would eventually die in 1979, drowning in a beach accident, never having faced trial. There was Walter Rauff, who had developed the gas fans used to murder Jews and others before the death camps were fully operational. Mobile killing chambers where victims were gassed by engine exhaust. He made it to Chile, where he lived until his death in 1984, despite multiple attempts at extradition. There was Erich Priebke, whom we'll hear more about later, an SS captain involved in the massacre of 335 Italian civilians at the Ardeatine Caves near Rome in 1944, a reprisal for a partisan attack. He lived in Argentina for decades before being discovered. There was Gerhard Bohner, who had been part of the T4 euthanasia program that killed over 70,000 disabled people in Germany before being expanded into the Holocaust. He escaped to Argentina and lived there from 1949 to 1963. Between 1946 and 1950, during the peak years of Nazi immigration to Argentina, it's estimated that more than 5,000 former Nazis entered the country. Some were major war criminals. Others were mid-level functionaries, concentration camp guards, Gestapo officers, members of Einsatzgruppen death squads. All had blood on their hands. All should have stood trial. Some became engineers, helping develop Argentina's industrial capacity. Others became doctors, practicing medicine under false credentials. Still others became businessmen, using their stolen wealth to start companies, buy land, build new lives. But others simply vanished into Argentine society, leaving almost no trace. They worked ordinary jobs, lived in ordinary neighborhoods, died ordinary deaths. Their secrets died with them. Their victims never received justice. Their crimes were never acknowledged, never punished. The capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 to 1962 was a watershed moment. For the first time, the Holocaust was discussed in detail in a public forum, broadcast around the world. Survivors testified about what they had endured. Documents were presented showing the systematic nature of the genocide.
The world was forced to confront what had happened. Eichmann himself was unrepentant. He claimed he was just following orders, just doing his duty, just a small cog in a large machine. "I was just a little man," he said. But the evidence showed otherwise. He had been zealous in his work, had gone beyond his orders, had taken initiative in solving the logistical problems of mass murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, the only death sentence ever imposed by an Israeli court. He was executed on May 31st, 1962, his body cremated, his ashes scattered in the Mediterranean Sea, beyond Israeli territorial waters, so that no trace of him would remain on Israeli soil. But even as Eichmann faced justice, hundreds or thousands of other Nazi war criminals continued living in peace across Argentina and South America. The world knew they were there. Israel knew. Germany knew. The Allies knew. But for various reasons, diplomatic concerns, Cold War priorities, the sheer difficulty of finding and extraditing them, most were left alone. They had escaped, and they knew it.
Over 1,000 miles from Buenos Aires, deep in the heart of Patagonia, lies the town of San Carlos de Bariloche, a paradise of mountains and crystalline lakes that looks like it was transplanted directly from the Swiss Alps. Snow-capped peaks tower over the town. Lakes of impossible blue stretch between forested valleys. The architecture is distinctly alpine, steep roofs, wooden chalets, flower boxes on every window. In the winter, it's a ski resort. In the summer, a hiking and fishing destination. It's one of the most beautiful places in Argentina, attracting tourists from around the world. But behind its beauty hides a darker past. A past that locals prefer not to discuss. A past that, even today, remains partially hidden. From the 1940s through the 1960s, Bariloche and other Patagonian towns became havens for Nazi fugitives. The region was perfect for men wanting to disappear. Remote, difficult to access in that era, with a significant German-speaking population that had been settling there since the late 19th century. The local German community was large enough that newcomers didn't stand out, but small enough that there was a sense of solidarity, of mutual protection. Locals whispered about secret meetings in mountain lodges, about symbols carved into trees or painted on rocks that only certain people understood, about strangers who spoke perfect German, but claimed to be from Silesia or the Sudetenland, who had technical knowledge far beyond what their supposed backgrounds would suggest, who had money, but no visible source of income, who avoided photographers and journalists like the plague, who never spoke of their past. One of them was Erich Priebke, a former SS Hauptsturmführer, captain, responsible for one of the most notorious massacres in Italy during World War II. Priebke had been born in Germany in 1913. He joined the Nazi Party in 1936 and the SS in 1937. He was eventually posted to Italy, where he served under SS Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Kappler in Rome. On March 23, 1944, Italian partisans carried out an attack in Rome, detonating a bomb that killed 33 German soldiers. Hitler, enraged, ordered a brutal reprisal: 10 Italians to be executed for every German soldier killed. Kappler was given the task of carrying out this order. He drew up lists of prisoners: Jews, political prisoners, partisans, common criminals, ultimately selecting 335 people. He needed more than the 330 the math suggested, because some groups of prisoners came in sets, and he wanted to avoid the paperwork of splitting them up. Among those selected were 75 Jews, including a 14-year-old boy. On March 24, 1944, these 335 men and boys were transported to the Ardeatine caves outside Rome. There, in groups of 5, they were taken into the caves, forced to kneel, and shot in the back of the head. Erich Priebke was one of the officers who did the shooting. He personally checked the list, ticking off names as people were killed. He shot at least 2 men himself, possibly more. After the massacre,
The Germans tried to seal the caves with explosives to hide the evidence. But after the liberation of Rome, the bodies were discovered. The Ardeatine massacre became one of the most infamous German atrocities in Italy. After the war, Priebke was briefly held in a British prisoner of war camp. But like Eichmann, his true identity and role weren't immediately known. He escaped in 1946, made his way to Argentina through the rat lines, and by 1948 was settled in Bariloche, living under his real name. So confident was he that he would never be found or extradited. For nearly 5 decades, Erich Priebke lived peacefully in Bariloche. He worked at a German language school teaching children. He ran a delicatessen. He was president of the local German Cultural Society. He was known as a respectable businessman, a pillar of the German community, a man who organized cultural events and supported local charities.
He married, had children, became a grandfather. He went to church, attended social events, lived openly and comfortably. His past was known to some in the German community, but it was never spoken of. There was an understanding. What happened during the war stayed in the past. Argentina was about starting over, about new beginnings, not about old guilts. Until 1994, when American television journalist Sam Donaldson and ABC News tracked him down. They interviewed him, and Priebke, now an old man, spoke openly about the massacre. He admitted his role, expressed no remorse, claimed he was just following orders. "I had to do my duty," he said. He seemed genuinely puzzled that anyone still cared about events from 50 years ago. The interview was broadcast internationally, causing outrage. Italy immediately requested his extradition. Argentina, under pressure, arrested Priebke. After a lengthy legal battle, he was extradited to Italy in 1995 to stand trial for war crimes. His trial in Rome was controversial and complex. The first trial resulted in a sentence of 15 years, but this was reduced to just 5 years due to mitigating factors and time already served, and he was released, only to be rearrested the same day after violent protests. A second trial resulted in a life sentence, but due to his age he was allowed to serve it under house arrest. He remained under house arrest in Rome until his death in 2013 at age 100. The Priebke case revealed something crucial. He wasn't alone in Bariloche. Other former Nazis had also settled in Patagonia, building lives in these remote mountain towns. But the full extent of these scientific networks remains unclear. Many documents were lost or destroyed. Personnel records were incomplete or deliberately falsified. And as time passed and these men died, the truth was buried with them. What remains are fragments, hints in archives, testimonies from elderly residents who remember German engineers with military bearing, who remember discussions in hushed German about the old days, who remember being told not to ask questions. There are also the physical traces. In Bariloche and other Patagonian towns, you can still see buildings constructed in the 1940s and 1950s with distinctly German architectural features that go beyond the merely Alpine aesthetic. Secret rooms, unusual basements, evidence of construction that suggests these weren't just homes but potential hiding places or meeting locations. Some researchers have claimed evidence of secret laboratories, of research into advanced weapons systems, even, in the most extreme theories, Nazi flying saucer programs relocated to Argentina. While these claims venture into conspiracy theory territory, they speak to the genuine mystery that surrounds this period. We know Germans came, we know some were Nazis, we know some were scientists, but the full picture remains obscured. The Argentine government has been reluctant to fully investigate. Opening these archives, examining this history too closely, risks exposing uncomfortable truths about official complicity. It would mean acknowledging that Argentina didn't just passively accept Nazi refugees, but actively facilitated them, that officials at the highest levels knew who these men were and welcomed them anyway, that Argentina became a sanctuary for some of history's worst criminals. For the German-Argentine community, it's also sensitive. Most German immigrants to Argentina were not Nazis,
had nothing to do with war crimes, came legally, and built honest lives. They understandably resent being associated with the criminals who hid among them. They want to remember their heritage, the culture, language, traditions, without it being overshadowed by this dark chapter. But the past doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. In Bariloche, tour guides sometimes mention the German connection to curious tourists, usually in vague terms. Elderly residents, when pressed, might share stories their parents told them. Researchers occasionally uncover new documents. The truth is there, beneath the surface of these beautiful mountain towns, hidden, but not gone, waiting.
In Buenos Aires, you can walk past buildings where they lived, shops they owned, businesses they ran. In Bariloche, you can stay in hotels they frequented, eat in restaurants they dined in. They became part of Argentine society, indistinguishable from other German immigrants, except for the secrets they carried. Some confessed on their deathbeds, unburdening themselves to priests or family members. Others took their secrets to the grave. Some left letters or documents to be opened after their deaths, explaining what they had done and why. Others left nothing, allowing history to remember them, if at all, as ordinary immigrants. Their children and grandchildren often knew nothing, or were told sanitized versions of the past. Grandfather was in the army during the war. He had to leave Germany because of political problems after the war. He never liked to talk about those times. Families built on foundations of lies, never knowing the truth until a journalist or researcher or chance discovery revealed it. But in the small towns of southern Argentina, whispers still remain. Old men, the last generation to remember the original arrivals, occasionally share stories over wine, about the German down the street who had nightmares and screamed in his sleep, about the one who got drunk once and started ranting about the war we should have won, about the elegant older gentleman who spoke perfect German and Spanish and French and kept a Luger pistol in his desk drawer, who became nervous whenever strangers asked questions, who died suddenly. A heart attack, they said, though some wondered, about the man with the slight accent who avoided photographers, who had a strange aversion to being recorded or interviewed, who feared only one thing: being remembered, being recognized, being identified. These whispers are fading now. The fugitives themselves are all dead. Even their children are elderly. The buildings they lived in have been renovated or demolished. The businesses they ran have changed hands multiple times. Time is erasing the physical traces. But the moral questions remain. How could a country knowingly shelter war criminals? How could communities accept these men, knowing or suspecting what they had done? How could the international community allow it to happen? What does it say about justice that most of these men never faced trial, never confessed, never paid for their crimes? And perhaps most troubling, are we certain this couldn't happen again? That in some future conflict, the perpetrators of atrocities might once again find countries willing to shelter them, communities willing to look the other way, a world willing to forget in the name of other priorities. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The mechanisms that allowed Nazi war criminals to escape, forged documents, corrupt officials, political convenience, public indifference, all still exist. The temptation to overlook past crimes in favor of present utility still exists. The human capacity to rationalize and forget still exists. The ghosts of the Reich haunt us not just because of what they did, but because of what their escape reveals about us, about our systems of justice, our international order, our collective memory, our priorities. For decades, rumors spread of a hidden network protecting these fugitives. An organization, or perhaps several interconnected organizations, that helped Nazi war criminals escape, settle, and evade justice. Some called it Odessa, supposedly standing for Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, Organization of Former SS Members. Whether Odessa existed as a formal entity or was simply a convenient name for various informal networks remains debated by historians. What's certain is that someone was helping these men. They didn't escape by luck alone. The system was too organized, too efficient. Escape routes were established and maintained for years. Safe houses existed at regular intervals along the routes from Europe to South America. Documents were forged with skill, suggesting official or semi-official resources. Money flowed to fund the operations. Information was shared about who was being hunted and who was safe. Some claimed there was a silent pact between former Nazis and Argentine officials, that certain members of Perón's government, themselves sympathetic to fascism or simply pragmatic about acquiring German technical expertise, had agreed to provide sanctuary in exchange for cooperation. That this pact continued even after Perón was overthrown in 1955, because too many people in the Argentine military and government were compromised, had taken money, or feared exposure. Others said Western intelligence agencies turned a blind eye or actively participated, because these men, with their technical knowledge and their fervent anti-communism, could be useful in the new Cold War. The enemy now wasn't German fascism, defeated and destroyed. The enemy was Soviet communism, spreading across Eastern Europe, threatening to expand further. And who better to fight communists than men who had spent years doing exactly that on the Eastern Front? There's evidence that American and British intelligence did, in fact, recruit former Nazis in the years after the war. Some were brought to the United States or Britain. Others were left in place in Germany or elsewhere to provide intelligence on Soviet activities. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America, their pasts whitewashed. If intelligence agencies were willing to do that, were they also willing to let certain war criminals escape to South America rather than face trial? The truth, as with much of this story, remains murky. Declassified documents show that Allied intelligence knew about Nazi escape routes and in some cases tracked fugitives to South America. But there's little evidence of active prevention, whether this was intentional policy, bureaucratic incompetence, lack of resources in the chaotic post-war period, or simply that hunting Nazi war criminals wasn't a top priority compared to the emerging Soviet threat. We may never fully know. What we do know is that the vast majority of Nazi war criminals who escaped to Argentina were never brought to justice. Most lived out their lives in peace and died free men. Their graves are scattered across Argentina, often unmarked or bearing false names. Their stories were erased, at least officially.
The Third Reich fell over 70 years ago. Adolf Hitler died in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The Nuremberg trials concluded in October 1946. The last Nuremberg-related trials ended in 1949. By any measure, the Nazi era is history, distant history for anyone born after the 1960s. Yet, in the silent corners of southern Argentina, traces of its shadow still linger. They built no monuments to their cause. They commissioned no statues of their Führer. They wrote no public memoirs celebrating their deeds. They left behind only whispers and ghosts, secrets buried in mountain valleys, truths concealed in falsified documents, stories told in hushed German by elderly men who remembered. Because some parts of history don't die. They don't fade peacefully into the past. They wait, hidden among the mountains, in unmarked graves, in sealed archives, in family secrets passed down generations or taken to the grave. They wait for someone brave enough to uncover them. For historians willing to dig through dusty records. For journalists willing to ask uncomfortable questions. For governments willing to open sealed files. For societies willing to confront difficult truths. The story of the Nazis who never left Argentina is a story about escape and sanctuary, about justice denied and crimes unpunished. But it's also a story about memory and forgetting, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to overlook. It's a reminder that history isn't neat and finished, that evil men don't always pay for their crimes, that the arc of the moral universe doesn't always bend toward justice, at least not in the lifetimes of those who suffered. But it's also a reminder that the truth has a way of emerging, eventually, that secrets don't stay buried forever, that even decades later, even after the perpetrators are dead, we can still uncover what happened, still bear witness, still say, this happened,
These men did these things, and we will not forget. The ghosts of the Reich haunt these mountains and valleys still, not as literal spirits, but as moral questions that remain unanswered, as archives still waiting to be fully explored, as stories still waiting to be told, as truths still waiting to be acknowledged. And they will continue to haunt us until we face them fully, until we acknowledge completely what happened here, until we learn the lessons they have to teach about justice and complicity, about memory and forgetting, about what we owe to history and to history's victims. The past never really leaves. It changes form, fades from view, gets buried under new concerns and new crises, but it's always there, waiting, hidden among the mountains, in the dark side of paradise.